This year we'll have paid off all of our general obligation bonds. Our fund balance is over 100% reserved for the general fund. And it's a pretty amazing position to be in.
After months of preparation and planning, the Jackson County Budget Committee recently held public hearings to hear departmental presentations and review the recommended budget for 2019-2020. Jackson County Administrator Danny Jordan begins this process with an overview to help set the foundation for the 6-member Budget Committee.
This is meant to be kind of a general quick overview of our budget, kind of framing it up for the presentation from the department directors and elected officials. This year we'll have paid off all of our general obligation bonds. Our fund balance is we have some projects on the table, but over 100% reserved for the general fund. And it's a pretty amazing position to be in. So operating revenue are things that are constant and predictable to us. Our tax base is something that's constant and predictable. We kind of can estimate what it's going to be each year. We can depend on it, and it's constant. We have non-operating revenue. These are things that a lot of people want us to spend money on for operations, but we don't, because once we spend them, they're gone. That's our fund balance, reserves, and windfalls. Windfalls are things like we sell a piece of property or we get some kind of revenue we didn't expect that's a one-time revenue. We have dedicated non-operating and dedicated operating revenue. That's for a specific purpose, so like our airport, our health and human services fund, or our road fund. And then we have non-dedicated, whose purpose of use is discretionary. What mostly the budget committee focuses on is non-dedicated operating revenue. And as you'll see here in the slides coming up, that's the least amount of revenue that we have. So this is how it looks when you graph it. That 12% is the kind of revenue that you get to make the decision about how it's spent. So of our total budget of $383,567,367, 12% is non-dedicated operating revenue. The red there, the 36%, that's dedicated operating revenue. So as I said, airport, road, health and human services. The green there, the 28%, is dedicated non-operating revenue. So that's fund balances, but for dedicated funds. And then 24% is non-dedicated, non-operating. That's essentially fund balance, contingency, and reserves in the general fund. So when you actually look at our operating budget, when we're just looking at operating revenues, not non-operating revenues, which are basically reserves, ending fund balance, and contingencies, then this is how it's broken out. About 75% of the revenues are for dedicated purposes. So of the operating budget of $186,422,717, 25% is non-dedicated. And that's where you're making the major decisions about what's going to happen with the budget. Of that 25%, here's how it's budgeted to be spent. I always make this qualification. You see that 79% of that $47,229,551, which is 25% of our operating budget, almost 80% of it gets spent on public safety. It doesn't leave a lot of money for the other discretionary services we have, but the other ones we have are internal services at a 4% rate. Our assessor's office, I say this every year, because a lot of people talk about in our community, public safety is the #1 priority. In my opinion, probably assessment is the #1 priority, because it's what funds everybody's local government to be able to deliver all of those services. So we don't want to cut that short and make sure we have that funded appropriately. And then health is the county's portion of services that we're responsible for. We don't only spend 7% of our non-dedicated revenue allocation on health, because most of it is funded by dedicated funding that comes from the state or federal government. But of our general fund, 7% of that discretionary spending goes to it. These are a couple points of information. You all ask me every year, what are our general fund reserves? So general fund reserves, $86,436,343. I said this before, but I think when I started in 2006, we had somewhere around 12 or 13 million. And between having that and this amount, we spent $200 million on capital projects over the last 10 years. So we've done really well managing our funds and building our fund balance. The current year we're in, we projected it at being $82,292,496. So you can essentially see we grew what we're budgeting for the reserves to be by about $4 million. Now that breaks out into a couple different things. We can't just spend all of that money. We set aside 65 million, almost 66 million in our rainy day fund. The rainy day fund is where we draw from capital projects or one-time expenditures, often as a reserve, either through a supplemental budget or, as you'll see, that we also budgeted 10 million for contingency. We need money to operate our government until we begin collecting taxes in November. We're in a really fortunate position because we've built reserves. We don't have to go out and borrow money, cost our citizens more money to be able to operate government until we begin collecting property taxes. When you look at our total reserves, so about 164 million of that is reserves, contingency, and ending fund balance. If you look at our budget from last year to this year, I'm just going to be general here, it went up about $30 million. And people are going to say, wow, you're spending $30 more million in a year? What are you doing? You're just spending recklessly. In local government, we have to budget savings also. We don't just budget expenditures. We're budgeting most of that $30 million increase is we're saving more money. We're not spending more money. This is kind of meant to be a visual depiction of what's happened with our budget. If you look to the left, our personnel services, the bar on the right, that's how it's increased this year. And throughout this entire budget process, I've told you we got hit pretty hard by PERS and also COLA and step increases, but mainly because of PERS, our personnel services went up. We don't have a net increase in FTE, we actually have a decrease in FTE. So even though we're lowering staff, our personnel costs still went up. And then you can see the biggest growth in all of these lines is our ending fund balance and reserves. That means our savings went up. We're saving more money than we're spending. So I want to talk a little bit about PERS because I keep bringing this up. This is actually from our actuarial. And you'll notice that I just highlighted kind of two areas. The normal cost rate, that first line, is what we're paying by percent of payroll for our current employees. The red line is what we're paying for people that are already retired, Tier 1, Tier 2, OBSERV, and this has to do with people that pulled out the money match as an option before they changed from Tier 1 and Tier 2 to OBSERV, and also the people that fall under full formula. I'm not going to go through every single one of those because I don't think they're that important, but if you get down to the bottom, the total net employer contribution rate. I want to note, if you look at the notes in the bottom, this does not include the 6% we pick up for PERS. So for all Tier 1 and Tier 2 people, we're paying 25.4% of payroll plus 6%. So we're over 30% of payroll for PERS for Tier 1 and Tier 2. General services, we're right at 30%. For police and fire, we're about 35%. 35% of payroll for police and fire is going to PERS. So you kind of get the point. This is why it is eating away at our budget each year. And we anticipate future expenses, at least in the next two biennia, after the current expenses that we're able to meet. We're able to meet that and keep our services the way that we're steady, consistent, and we're able to do that because we planned for this.